Okay, we're going to go through the introduction to populations real fast. So we have Worldometer, a nice resource that's helpful. It's got all kinds of different data on there. This is what we used for predicting those numbers and then checking the actual values. Okay. Populations are increased through births and immigration. They are decreased through death and emigration. Emigration is leaving a population for another one. Immigration is entering a population from another one. Births and deaths are self-explanatory. Then we have metapopulations. You do not need to know these five. You just need to know that metapopulations exist. They are populations within populations that occasionally intermingle, and that's a nice way to mix up genetics. Uh, Wildlife corridors are how they connect and how they mix those genetics. You have a couple of different types. You have land bridges that move over highways, so animals don't get smushed. You have tunnels that move under highways, so animals don't get smushed. And then you have different sorts of wildlife preserves and protected areas that are interconnected that let critters safely move around in nature. You have bee highways, which are little temporary nests and hives that are set up for critters, specifically bees, so they can go ahead and take a rest, get some pollen, get something to eat before they make their next little journey. Cities typically don't have enough flowers for bees to be able to safely make their journey, so this is a way to help the bees. And as we all know from watching Bee Movie, bees are kind of important. And then we have the European Green Belt. It stretches along the former Iron Curtain, and it is a area that was kind of left for nature to reclaim. And about half a century later, when the Iron Curtain fell, it was decided to leave it alone and just leave it as a way for animals to migrate or just basically live without human interference. And then we have inbreeding. Inbreeding is when you're mating with people who are genetically similar to you. The example here is we have two snakes, and then these are brothers and sisters that are mating with each other, and you end up with this recessive deleterious, meaning a negative trait, a disadvantage, being expressed, which is just helping spread it through your population. It's very common in critters that have had drastic reductions in their population size, like cheetahs and rhinos, or some people from West Virginia. That's funny. If you're from West Virginia, no offense. So, yeah. Then we have the second part, life history strategies. Here's the life cycle and business of a frog. This is how it spends its time. Add a couple flies in there, and that's it. They're shaped by evolution. Evolution is the result of natural selection, and natural selection is driven by adaptations for the environment. Yay. The growth rate of a population is influenced by these life history strategies. These are the four biggest variables: age of first reproduction, number of offspring, amount of parental care given to the offspring, and the energy cost of reproduction. How much time and energy a critter spends trying to make more of its species. Okay, this part's important. College Board loves to ask about this concept. We have R selection and K selection. R selection has specific characteristics to it. K selected are essentially just the opposite. They're inverts of each other. So in R selection, most energy and life goes into reproduction, not survival. Their goal in life is to propagate, not necessarily live long, fulfilling lives. They're not very good competitors because they're opportunists. When advantages are in their favor, their populations increase a lot. And once those conditions are no longer favorable, their populations plummet. They have a very variable population. They don't exist near carrying capacity. Here are the characteristics. Make sure you know this list. They tend to be small. They reproduce when they are young. They have many offspring, and most of those offspring do not survive to adulthood. Most of those little baby species that are being created die. Hard bummer, but it happens. There's little to no parental care. For example, fish will fertilize eggs and then have nothing to do with those baby fish ever again. Their populations exhibit exponential growth over short term. Any population will experience exponential growth provided the limiting factors aren't stopping it. It is much easier for our selected species to do that exponential growth in short term. They do better in unpredictable environments because their populations can increase so quickly. They're more heavily influenced by density independent factors like natural disasters or other changes in your environment, and they exhibit type 3 survivorship, which we'll talk about in a moment. And then examples. The three best examples to know: bacteria, insects, and oysters. The other ones are also examples, but bacteria, insects, and oysters are the ones that come up most commonly in the exams, and they're pretty common enough that you probably know most of these characteristics of them. K-selected, like I said, are just the opposites. Their energy is more in survival. Reproduction is obviously important, but they're not constantly reproducing. They have mating seasons, etc. Most of their energy goes into just living. They have high levels of parental care. For instance, the penguins will lay an egg, and then both parents will take care of it for a long time until it hatches, and then even after it's born to help give it a better chance of surviving to adulthood. They're good competitors. They have more adaptations. Part of that is genetic diversity. R-selected tend to not have as much genetic diversity as K-selected. They do best in ecosystems that are fairly consistent. I wouldn't say constant. For instance, bears, they live through all 4 season changes, and they do very well in all 4 seasons. So it's not necessarily constant. We're looking for consistent environmental conditions. Let's change that. There we go. Populations tend to exist close to carrying capacity. Unless there's some sort of catastrophe and their population dips, they tend to live near carrying capacity. Their populations stay close to what that ecosystem can support. Characteristics: they are larger, they reproduce later in life, they have fewer offspring, and most survive. They have high levels of parental care. They live in those predictable environments, and they are more influenced by density-dependent factors like parasitism or number of mates, amount of food, etc. And their populations exhibit type 1 survivorship curves. Like I said, the characteristics are just the opposite of R-selected, so take a note of those. And then compare them to this. They are straight up opposites. And then here are your example critters. The best example critters: humans. And then we're going to change most mammals to large mammals. So we're looking for large mammals like elephants, whales, bears, rhinos, giraffes, etc. Big mammals. Not necessarily all mammals, because K and R selected is a spectrum. You can have things like rabbits that are mammals, but they have properties of both K selected and R selected species. They have many young at once, like a K selected, but they have pretty high levels of parental care, like a K selected. So they tend to fall in between. When College Board asks you, they'll ask you one of these more extreme examples where there's not really, well, it could be K, it could be R. They'll give you examples that are definitely K or definitely R. And then finally, your survivorship curves. These 3 survivorship curves, make sure you know them. College Board is almost guaranteed to ask you a question using this graphic. Type 1 are K selected. Type 3 are R selected. What this graph is showing you is number of individuals that are born, number that are still living at different points in their lifespan. Now, here at the bottom, it's based on percent lifespan, not absolute numbers. This does not mean that plants, coral, and humans all live the same amount of time and then die. It's based on percent. 100% of a plant's lifespan will probably be less than 100% of a human's lifespan. Now, what's important here is that in type 1, populations that are born, for every 1,000 that are born, most of them will make it to adulthood. Very few die when they're young because of that high level of parental care, whatever. There's different variables at play. But most of those young will be born. They'll survive into reproduction age, and then their bodies will hit kind of what is their genetic old age, where their body is just kind of like, okay, yep, it's time. And it starts to shut down and break down. And then most will live through youth, And then within a pretty short amount of time, that's when most of the population will start to die. For humans, it's like 75, 80-ish. For type 3, it's the opposite. Most don't make it through infancy. Now, this is a logarithmic scale, so it might look like, about a quarter of them live. It's not a quarter. If you look at the individuals, it's starting with 1,000. By the time they hit 10% of their lifespan, there's fewer than 10 left. Most die when they are young. The ones that do make it to adulthood tend to live out the rest of their lives with the same sort of rate of mortality. Now, eventually, everything that lives dies, so the graphs will all end at 100%. Now, type 2 are these kind of critters, the ones that you find in between K and R selected. There's no correlation between age and rate of death. They'll die just as likely when they're young as when they are old. Here, the example is coral. You should also be on the lookout for songbirds, not birds of prey, little songbirds, and small mammals like mice and rats and squirrels. And yeah, that's all.